Hey, this is David for Big Bits, and this is our 9th video in the scripting tutorial series, and we are finally on the topic of creating a strategy. Now, what we're going to be doing is we're actually going to be converting our indicator that we've been working on into a strategy and having it place orders and create positions for us, and then we'll take a look at the back testing and the performance report of the strategy. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, the first thing I'm going to do, I'm actually going to hide myself here. Okay, so now you can actually see a little bit better. I know the text is kind of small. My apologies for that. But the scaling on the zoom here doesn't work real great. So if you're on a phone or something, see if you can zoom in. Otherwise, I recommend really watching on a desktop where you have higher resolution and you can see these things a little bit better. Anyways, now, the first thing we did to convert this to a strategy is we changed our original function, which was a study, into a strategy. And I've got the code in the reference manual pulled up here so we can take a look at what a strategy is and what all of the different parameters are for it and what they do. We're not going to go over all of them. We're just going to touch a few for now so you can get an idea of what's going on. But before we get too far into it, that's the main takeaway. You change your study to a strategy, and then we can play around with a few things. You can see on the chart we have our entries and our exits. The entries are blue, the exits are this magenta, purple, kind of pink color. Now, once you have the strategy, you can open up the strategy tester, and here you can see a performance summary of your strategy. So with the default information and what I've put into the strategy, these are the net profit, and as of right now it doesn't include fees, but we'll get to that later. There's also some things you can compare it to: gross profit, gross loss, max drawdown, other information you can find important for your back testing, including Sharpe ratio. Just a lot of great information. It also includes your list of trades. Now keep in mind that when you're working on smaller resolutions or time frames like 15-minute candles, there is a limit to how far back the back testing goes. Now I'm just looking at the BLX symbol, which has the longest history of data, but it only has daily candles. So the back testing can handle the entire history of Bitcoin trading with that. So let's actually get back into the code. You can actually see our changes here with our strategy, what it has done. Now let's get into the actual changes here. Now we also had a short title and a title with our study. We also used overlay with that. But what we are doing now is we are adding a few new parameters. We are adding what's called pyramiding, a default quantity type, and a default quantity value. So let's take a look at what those are. Pyramiding is the maximum number of entries allowed in the same direction. Okay, we're just going to be going long, so we really only want to keep track of one entry with this particular strategy. If you wanted to do more than one, then you can. You just have to input the value in pyramiding. Now I can show you in a little bit the impacts this causes with our current strategy. We'll leave it how it is for now. We also had our default quantity type, which we chose the percent of equity, and I set it to 100 because we're going to be trading with 100% of our equity based on what you put into the back tester. And then for the default quantity value, was that the one? Excuse me. Yeah, default quantity value, that is the percent of equity that you're using. So that is the 100% of equity. So we tell it what we're going to use here and how much of it we're going to use here. And that kind of takes care of things. Now, let me pull myself back into the screen here. Okay, let's continue looking at this. Right now, we can see our list of trades. Let's go back to our Pine editor and let's see how changing the pyramiding impacts this. Let's set that to 3. This will give us up to 3 entries. We have to wait for the change in the strategy to be compiled and applied. So this will take just a moment. Okay, there you go. There's a lot more entries now. So let's take a look at our strategy tester. You can see there are a lot more trades. Look at our performance. We have a very high net profit. And we also, on the buy and hold return, that is if you were to buy at the beginning of the backtesting period and hold it, and that's your returns. So if you bought Bitcoin at the very start here, which would have been very, very small amounts, and sold it at the current candle, that would be your return percentage. And this is what you would have got if you played the markets since it began. Now, obviously, this has been highly volatile, so these numbers are going to be absolutely incredibly large compared to a lot of the other things you're looking at, especially comparing anything to crypto over the last few years. You can get wild swings, and the numbers can be very high here, especially if a good strategy. So one thing I forgot to show you earlier is actually the overview, and this gets posted on the script itself, and for some reason I haven't updated here, but as you can see, let's let this load. Underneath the description, you see the performance overview as well. So let's go back to our overview here and see our equity is the blue line and our drawdown is the red line. And you have some other information here that you've already seen on the other page, but it's just a nice kind of dashboard or summary for your back testing. Now let's go back to our list of trades. Now, one of the issues I had with the pyramiding is when we changed it to 3 and we allowed multiple entries, is that a particular entry was closed by a different exit. Okay, so these aren't really positions that are managed with like a unique ID. These are just entries, so it doesn't matter what caused them to open. Anything can close them if a exit is called. So let's take a look at an example here. The reason we entered along here at number 2 was because we had the MA1 crossover MA3. And with our default settings, that is a 50 over 200 SMA cross. And it exited, it closed the entry on a 1 over 2. Now, it says 1 over 2, but it was really the 1 crossing under the 2. And the reason it says that is because in the script, you're actually supposed to use an ID. And actually, let's go look at the reference here, because this will make a bit more sense. So when we close, you're technically supposed to be able to use an ID of the identifier for the entry. So if we had entered with a 1 over 2, based on the documentation, it should close when you have a 1 over 2 as the ID or the identifier for your close. But for some reason, it doesn't work like that. I'm not sure if I'm just not reading the documentation correctly or what, but you can see that with the identifier being the same, it actually closed one of a different type. Now, this can cause issues when your back testing goes back before one of these occurred. So if we started our back testing all the way back here and we were already if the first thing that happened was we were already above and the first thing that happened was a cross under, then if you had an entry for any other reason, it would have closed it. And that's what you're seeing here is we had our 1 over 2 and it closed the very first 1 over 2 here. But then our second position was a 1 over 3. But our next close was actually a 1 under 2. So it ended up closing the second position because the second close was because of the 1 under 2. It's a little bit confusing, but essentially, based on how it's set up, I don't believe there's much order to it. But that's why I decided to keep the pyramiding at 1, and we just focus on one entry. And it doesn't really matter to us what causes the entry or the exit, as long as there is a crossover. Now, I have added settings in here to take care of that, and we'll get to that in just a moment to where you can make it to where there's only one crossover that you're looking for. Let's go ahead down now. I did make a change to how the labels handled crossovers. We had to separate the logic out for detecting the crossovers. So we did that here. They have to be visible And this is just kind of optional. You don't actually have to have them visible on your chart to do this. You would have to change the code in order to enable that. But for me to trigger it in this situation, I was checking that they were visible and the crossover did occur. And we were storing that in that variable. Then if we wanted to show the crosses, and I have it disabled, and let's actually show you what that would do. You can actually see the X's and the crossovers now because of that, but we can still trade even if those aren't on thanks to this change here. I just wanted to point that out. That's not a huge change. It didn't impact any functionality, but if you're following along, you might want to go back up and check out how we're doing this. And if you're not too familiar with coding, this is basically a conditional statement. If they are all true, because we're using AND here, it will return a true value here. And when we use it to check for conditions here, it's going to return a true there as well if it was true when we checked it to the other conditions. Now, there's really not a whole lot of code involved to this. We're checking now for when we should do our entries. Now, the entry for a 1/2 crossover requires that we have our crossover and that we have something called trade MA12 crossovers set to true as well. Now, what is that? This is actually another setting we've added, and I'll scroll back up in just a moment, to where you can configure it whether or not you want to trade the specific crossovers. This is just another example of adding options into your code. So you saw the example with the pyramiding, how we could have multiple entries and it didn't matter which one closed it. Well, if we only wanted to trade a particular crossover, we could just uncheck these. Or let's say we just wanted to do the 50 over and under the 200 SMA. That would be the MA13. Okay, you can see it crossed over the 200 here, and all the way over here it crossed under, and that's when it exited. That probably wouldn't have been a great time to exit. You would have liked to have exited over here somewhere, but this is just an example, just a tutorial. You can see that the logic dictates that that's when it should have closed, and it did. Now, I wanted to show you that these were just other settings like we had for our indicators before, and you can see that is the case. It is exactly like the checkbox for show ribbons, except we have just changed the name slightly to correspond with what trades they would impact. And let's just take another look at that here. By default, they are all on. As I said, this is just a tutorial, so these things may not be perfect, but they do show you how things work. Now, let me see if there's anything else here that I wanted to point out. I did want to go over the entries and exits. We kind of mentioned this, but let's go look into the code a little bit more. We talked about these conditions already and how they had to be true, of course, to execute. But there's also the strategy entry and the strategy close that we need to look at. Now, I've already mentioned that they have an identifier, and when you close, you can also pass in the identifier here to attempt to close that entry, but from what I can tell, that hasn't been working. So keep that in mind. As I've already mentioned, the close may close one with a different identifier. Now, if you know the correct way to do that and I'm reading the documentation incorrectly and I'm expecting the wrong thing to happen here, please let me know and we can go back and correct that in a later video. But for now, we're going to continue on. With our entry, we need to specify the direction, and that is going to be a long in this case. Let's pull up the reference manual and look at the entry. You can see you can enter a long or a short, and you can use the strategy type. I believe it was strategy.long. It just returns a true value. If you're true, you're going long. If you're false, you're going short. And you can see that here in their documentation. Now, when you pass in this third variable here, that's actually a quantity. And that variable is missing from mine because if you hard code that in as 1, it means you will trade one contract or 1% of your equity. However you have your back testing set up, it will just use 1 every single time you trade instead of using the parameters that you've set. So keep that in mind. That's why we don't have it here. And then I've also added a comment as well, which really, it hasn't really done anything as far as I can tell. Perhaps it shows up in the backtesting results somewhere for something important. And then with the close, let's look at the reference manual again. Go to close. Now the close is set to where, as I said, you're supposed to be able to use an identifier to be able to close an order by referencing its identifier. Perhaps when it says close an order, it's just referring to an open order. So if we were using limit orders instead, maybe it would have closed the limit order instead of closing the position. But I think that's what the cancel is for. If you can correct me, that'd be great. But from the documentation that I'm reading, that's what it means. Now, back to close, you can also set your conditions in the statement, and this also applies to the entry as well. You can see both here the entry and the close have conditions on them. So if you wanted to declare strategy.close and then put the conditions in it, you could have, but we're checking for the conditions here because if we want to do any other logic, we can do that here as well, as opposed to fixating the logic within this one line of code. This way we do it, we can open ourselves up to doing more code at the same time if we needed to. As of right now, we don't, but maybe later on that'll be useful. So I keep that in mind when I'm coding things. I like them to be flexible. And if we put our condition within the close statement, then it's not quite as flexible, and we might have to go back and change it again anyway. Now, continuing on, I did mention that this is a long only using market orders, and you can see there is an option to use limit orders, and there are several different options for strategies on how to place stops, use different types of orders, and there are even options to configure commissions with the backtesting, and we'll get into all of that later on. Just the fact that we are omitting the limit parameter on the strategy means that we are using market orders by default. Now, if you specify on your entry anything valid on the limit parameter, it will use the limit orders. Now, if you do the same thing for your close, it'll do the same thing there. So just keep this in mind and always look at the reference, or the reference manual, I should say, to get an idea of what you are able to do. There's definitely a lot just related to the strategy itself. Now, let's go back and take another look at the back testing just to give you an idea of what's going on here. And I know we've covered it some, but we'll go over it again because we've changed some of the settings. We are only trading crossovers on MA1 over 3 and under 3. So we've only had a handful of these on the daily chart in the entire history of Bitcoin. You can see the first one was on this particular date, February 10th, 2012, and there was not an exit until April 10th, 2014. So from here to here, and you can see our second trade, July 13th to September 16th, 2014, and so on. You can see there was a really good one here. That was the 2017 bull market. And yeah, that was a nearly 3-year trade, 2.5 years at least. And one other thing that I wanted to point out that was very important with the trades and the back testing is that we currently have an open position. Now, the back testing is really good, except I believe it is missing out on calculating our profit here. And this is something that you're having to deal with when you're actually trading, is that if you have an open position, it is either in profit or not. So when you're looking at this here, you perhaps do have that drawdown from when your entire percentage in is now down to here. So you went long here, your peak profit of that trade would have been up here, and you've been losing profits ever since then, and that's really not captured here. And that's pretty critical also when you're looking at the performance summary, because when you're looking at buy and hold returns, this includes the entire price history or the maximum amount back that it will go, the maximum number of candles back it will go. But the net profit is limited because it also doesn't include our profit here. We have a trade that started, let's go back to the list of trades. We have a trade that started at 5,536, and the current price as of the video is 8,219. So that's a pretty good profit, but it isn't included in our profit summary. So it's kind of hard to compare these numbers. If you're doing shorter time frames, lower resolutions, then it's probably going to be more accurate because you're in and out more often on your trades. But when you have a trade open for several months and there's huge price changes, it can impact the results in the performance summary to make you think that perhaps your strategy isn't quite as good as it really is. So once we would calculate the actual amount in here, then perhaps it's better than the buy and hold return. Now, one way to do this would be to, on the last candle of the back test, just tell it to close any open positions, and that would tell you where you would be at if you close them all today. But at the same time, you also want to know if you have any open positions as well. Plus, if you were to use it to do the trading with the strategy, then you also you wouldn't want all of your positions to close immediately because it's the current candle is the same one that it opened on, or on the next candle when there's another one that it can process. But anyway, we're going to take a look at limit orders and the stops, commissions, all sorts of things. If you have any ideas for what you want to see here, please let me know. Leave a comment on the video. If you like the video, please like. Also, please subscribe if you like these videos. If you like these types of videos, please like. I also do other things on the channel, crypto related. So please subscribe, and thank you very much, and have a great day.